welcome. Bienvenidos todos. My name is David Ortiz. I am the faculty fellow for the Center for Latin American and Border Studies class here at NMSU. And it is my great pleasure to actually reboot our on-campus speaker series. We have been having since the pandemic these events online, and it is for the first time that we are able to do it hybrid. So we're very excited about that. We want to thank the Department of Anthropology, the Department of Criminal Justice, the Department of Government, the Department of History, and the Department of Sociology for actually helping us co-sponsor our speaker. So it is with great pleasure that we are able to have Jo Marie Burt here. And I will do a brief introduction, though her bio is much longer than the introduction that I'm going to give her. Jo Marie Burt is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Sklar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and a Senior Fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America, a leading human rights research and advocacy organization. Dr. Burt's research focuses on political violence, human rights, and transitional justice in post-conflict societies, focusing on Peru and more recently on Guatemala. She is the author of Political Violence and the Authoritarian State in Peru, Silencing Civil Society, which has received the honorable mention for the Walnut Duke Book Award in Human Rights in Latin America. In 2002-2003, Dr. Burt was appointed to the research team of the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She has been a visiting professor, a Fulbright scholar, and held the Alberto Flores Galindo Chair at the Pontifical Catholic University in Peru. In 2007 to 2009, she served as an international observer to the human rights trial of former Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori, and has written extensively about his conviction and other human rights trials in Peru. Her current research focuses on war crimes prosecutions in Guatemala, which she has monitored for International Justice Monitor and as a co-founder and co-director of Verdad y Justicia in Guatemala. She is completing a manuscript entitled The Justice We Deserve, War Crimes and Prosecutions in Guatemala. Dr. Burt is also the Vice President, President-elect of the Latin American Studies Association, LASA, and you can follow her at Jo Ma Burt. It is with great pleasure that we have the honor of having Dr. Jo Marie Burt here. Jo Marie.
Thank you, David. Pleasure to be here. I think this might be one of the first events in person I've given since the pandemic as well. So thanks to the Center for Latin American and Border Studies at NMSU for inviting me, for having me here, for bringing me out all the way from DC. It's a real pleasure. So today I'm going to talk about war crimes prosecutions in Peru and Guatemala. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to start talking about why this is an important issue and how it fits within the larger story of what's happening in Latin America today. Before I get into any of that, let me just describe maybe what a war crimes prosecution is for those of you who may think those words don't mean anything, because we don't necessarily talk about these things very much, especially here in the United States. So war crimes prosecutions are trials, they're legal procedures in which a court of law sets out to establish individual responsibility of those accused of grave crimes of human rights, whether they're crimes against humanity, genocide, massacres, extrajudicial executions, forced disappearance, sexual violence, among others. Scholars have been working for the last several years on this topic, and Catherine Sikink, who's a fairly well-known IR scholar in political science, wrote a really important book around 10 or 11 years ago called The Justice Cascade, in which she does a quantitative analysis, right? And she's documenting that throughout the world, there is a trend towards individual accountability for these kinds of atrocities, whether they're committed in wartime or during authoritarian periods of government. And her research is super interesting. She finds that Latin America is actually leading the way in domestic prosecutions of these kinds of atrocities. Typically these cases occur in international tribunals. In 2002, the international community created the International Criminal Court, which is one of the places where you'll see these kinds of international trials taking place for wartime or other atrocities. There are sometimes special courts set up to deal with atrocities in different places. So the first and most famous one perhaps was the International Criminal Court, International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Then there was one for Rwanda, for the genocide in Rwanda. And there have been a number of other ones since in Cambodia, Charles Taylor, and so on and so forth. But Latin America, I wouldn't say that it's unique, but it is the leader in pursuing these kinds of criminal trials in a domestic court of law. Typically, these cases go to international courts precisely because domestic courts of law are too weak, too corrupt, too compromised, right? To hear these kinds of cases in a fair and impartial way, which is absolutely necessary for these courts to be meaningful. If it's a kangaroo court, I'm not interested, right? That's not justice. You have to guarantee, and this is really important. As an observer, one of the things when I started observing trials, and the Fujimori trial was the first one. One of the first things I came to understand was that above all, I had to document that the rights of the defendant, the person who's being accused of grave atrocities, are being respected, because otherwise it's not a free, fair, and impartial process, and that's super important. I think for Latin America, this is also extraordinary because as Uruguayan novelist and writer Eduardo Galeano once wrote, Latin America was a sanctuary of impunity for these kinds of crimes until very recently. So the fact that at least some countries are trying to grapple with a legacy of grave violations of human rights and bring those responsible to account is really significant. That said, there are some countries that have experienced these kinds of atrocities in the context of either civil wars or internal armed conflicts or authoritarian rule, where there's really been little headway in pursuing these kinds of prosecution. Brazil comes to mind. El Salvador comes to mind. In both of these cases, there have been 0 trials culminated against war criminals or other individuals accused of grave human rights abuses. Places where you do see prosecutions happen, obviously Peru and Guatemala, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Argentina is really one of the champions, I would say, of human rights prosecutions. Up till now, I've lost count, but it's over 100 sentences have been handed down. Over 1,000 former police and military and others, officials and others, have been prosecuted for these kinds of atrocities connected to the last military dictatorship in Argentina. Chile also has seen a number of very significant human rights trials. Uruguay has also seen some important human rights prosecutions. But as I said, some places you've seen almost nothing. And there's a new system emerging in Colombia, which is just emerging from, well, there's still violence going on. There's still guerrilla groups that are still at war with the state of Colombia, but there have been important peace agreements, and there are efforts to pursue prosecutions in Colombia as well right now. So before I get into the discussion about Peru and Guatemala and move into my power, I'm just going to show you some images from Latin America while I keep talking, and then I'll get to Peru and Guatemala. I just want to talk briefly about Latin America's violent past, the transitions that took place from authoritarian to democratic rule in the 1980s and early 1990s, that for the most part consecrated pacts of impunity that protected those responsible for these kinds of human rights violations from prosecution. Then I'll discuss the disruptions that started to happen from civil society that began to challenge these arrangements and allow, and at least in some countries, for these prosecutions to move forward. Because I'm assuming not everyone here is familiar with this past and thought it was useful to just discuss it very briefly. So in the 60s, 70s, and 1980s, much of Latin America was governed by military dictatorships steeped in the doctrine of national security, which viewed virtually any citizen who challenged the military government as a threat to the nation state, and therefore as the internal enemy, quote unquote, that needed to be removed from the body politic. And this policy is what led to massive violations of human rights like those I've discussed before. These dictatorships banned political parties, they closed Congress, ruled by fiat, they restricted the free press, they often imposed censorship, they brutally repressed trade unions, peasant federations, student organizations, journalists, and human rights defenders. And as I already said, hundreds of thousands of people throughout the region were killed, forcibly disappeared, tortured, families were torn apart, children were orphaned, communities destroyed. Due to a number of factors I'm not going to go into here for lack of time, involving economic mismanagement, citizen arrest, disarray within the military itself, these regimes begin to give way to elected civilian governments that begin to take power throughout the region. This is one of what Samuel Huntington called the third wave of democracies. I'm sure you're all familiar with that term. In most cases, the military itself dictated the terms of transition, even though there was growing effervescence among previously banned political parties and civil society movements. And in such what political scientists refer to as negotiated or pacted transitions, elections were held, new civilian governments were installed, citizen rights were, at least in theory, restored, but the military retained a great deal of power. So as a result, the question of what to do about those responsible for grave violations of human rights, what to do about the torturers, was fundamentally shaped by these pacted transitions. Only in Argentina, after 7 years of military rule, where 10 to 30,000 people were forcibly disappeared by the military, where the military regime collapsed for a series of reasons. A new civilian government came in and embraced the human rights demands of the very well-organized human rights movement in Argentina. You may have all heard of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. There was a state-led effort to prosecute those responsible for human rights violations during the military government. First, there was a truth commission set up by the new government, the government of Raúl Alfonsín, the CONADEP, the National Commission on Missing Persons. And then that documented around 10,000 people who were disappeared by the dictatorship, right? And then that information and other information was used to prosecute the top generals who had ruled over Argentina during these 7 harsh years of military rule. That took place in 1985, and you may have heard there's a new film that actually tells this story of the actual trial. It's called Argentina 1985. It was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Foreign Film. It didn't win, but it is a brilliant film, and I highly recommend, it's on Amazon Prime, I highly recommend watching this film. And what you'll see is that 5 of the 9 members of the junta, the generals, were were convicted and sent to prison. And other human rights prosecutions began occurring in Argentina as individuals started bringing cases to court and demanding justice for their cases, right? This prompted a series of military uprisings. And without going into too much detail here, in effect, this prompted Alfonsín, the president, to backtrack on his human rights policy. He passed down a series of amnesty laws that would eventually shield all military and police and other officials from prosecutions in these cases. And in '89, a pardon was actually passed, allowing those 5 generals who'd been convicted in '85 to go home. So that the situation, the status quo ante of impunity, was restored. And so the other countries in the rest of the region that are looking at Argentina's experiment in what was called transitional justice, investigating the past to try to achieve some level of reconciliation, right? Said, oh, yeah, maybe we should not try that. That might be too dangerous. It puts our democracy at risk. But there were also other motivations in not wanting to pursue prosecutions against the military, remembering, of course, that the military retains a lot of power, and there are alliances that are developing these new democracies. So you have cases like Uruguay and Brazil, where nothing was done by the state. After the transition to democracy, there was no truth commission, no prosecutions. There weren't even reparations programs for victims. The state continued to deny, really, that human rights violations had occurred at all. So this was the opposite of transitional justice, right? And amnesty laws, this is really important. Amnesty laws either put in place by the dictatorships themselves or by these new democracies, which was the case for Uruguay. The newly elected Congress passed an amnesty law shielding the military that had just left power from criminal prosecution. So these amnesty laws sort of sealed the deal and made it impossible for local courts to prosecute human rights abusers. And again, the military unrest in Argentina was cited as proof that criminal prosecutions were a fool's game, right? That they threatened stability and undermined the fragile new democracies that we're now seeing in Latin America. So in some cases, what you start to see is you get, for example, Chile is a really good example of this. You get a center-left government that takes over after the 17 years of the Pinochet dictatorship. And this government is not quite content with doing nothing. But Pinochet, he stays on as the head of the armed forces for 8 more years in the new democracy. And then he's going to become a senator for life. This is all written into his new constitution, which is now the subject of a lot of controversy in Chile today. The new government, the Alwin government, said, well, okay, maybe we can't in fact, Pinochet said to Alwin, you cannot prosecute, he said, you cannot touch a hair on the head of any of my men. Meaning, you can't prosecute or else I will carry out another coup. So there was an implicit, not even implicit, direct threat, right? So what Alfonsín did, and this happened in other parts of Latin America and the world, South Africa being another example, the government created a truth commission where the idea was, okay, if we can't prosecute, at least we can listen to the voices of the victims. We can hear their stories, we can hear about what happened, we can help dignify them, we can help break down some of the silence and the impunity surrounding, if not through judicial action, at least through hearing the voices of the victims. So in Chile, El Salvador, Guatemala, you had this new formula where you had a truth commission that investigated the crimes of the past, but no prosecutions, right? But these arrangements, right, didn't last for very long. There was a lot of disruption happening, and this disruption really came about through the action of human rights groups and organizations of survivors and families of victims of these dictatorships or military governments. They adopted a variety of different strategies at home and abroad to make what happened in their countries known, to denounce the individuals responsible, and to pursue justice. So, for example, in some countries, victims sought ways to get around existing amnesty laws. So in Argentina, though the amnesty laws were in place, preventing, in theory, prosecutions from moving forward, right? Human rights lawyers said, oh, but that law does not include the crime of baby kidnapping. And baby kidnapping was one of the surprisingly terrible atrocities that the Argentinian dictatorship carried out. They would, women who were pregnant when they were arrested, or who had small children at the time of their arrest, their children would be taken from them and usually given away in illegal adoptions to military or police families. So they were able to prosecute Videla, one of the head dictators, on the crime of baby kidnapping because it wasn't included in the amnesty law. So that's one other thing they try to go around the amnesty laws using their own domestic jurisdictions. They also went to the international system. So there's this thing called, we talked about this in class earlier this morning, there's this thing called the Inter-American System for Human Rights that almost all countries in Latin America and in the Americas are part of through the Organization of American States. There's the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, which receives complaints by citizens about and communities about human rights abuses that are not being addressed by the judicial systems in their countries. In other words, where impunity is rampant. And then if the case is not resolved, the commission might send the case forward to the Inter-American Court, which will then carry out a hearing to determine whether not an individual, but whether the state of the given country is responsible. And so particularly Argentina, Peru and Guatemala and human rights groups and victims organizations were very prolific at bringing cases before the inter-American system. And as these cases begin to be processed through this system, you begin to see sentences ordering the respective states to investigate, prosecute, and punish those responsible. And I'll talk about this in a bit in the Peru case, how important this is. In 2001, the court actually emits a ruling in a massacre case involving the Fujimori government in Peru, the Barrios Altos massacre, in which it not only determines that the Peruvian state is responsible for the massacre, it also says, Peruvian state, you have an amnesty law that prevents prosecution, so you can't fulfill this obligation that we're imposing on you. So therefore, we are determining that your amnesty law, which violates international law and the American Convention on Human Rights, is null and void. So the International Court actually reaches into the Peruvian legal system and says that law is no longer on the books. And that actually opens up the space in Peru for prosecutions to move forward, even before the Peruvian Truth Commission completed its report, which wasn't until 2003. Right, so that's a super important moment for these kinds of criminal justice processes in Latin America, and other countries like Argentina grabbed that example. And so in 2001, Argentinian Human Rights Group went before a local court and said, the Inter-American Commission has just, the Inter-American Court has just ruled this, and therefore, along with other reasons, we believe that the Argentinian amnesty laws are unconstitutional and should be nullified. And the court agreed. And then it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in the end also agreed, and the amnesty laws were completely nullified. And so in Argentina, this opened the space for prosecutions to move forward in Argentina after almost 2 decades of total impunity. So there's this dramatic, it takes a long time. And that is a source of frustration, obviously, for the victims and for the human rights community. I don't want to diminish that at all. But it is a really significant step forward, not only for crimes connected to these Cold War dictatorships, but for human rights moving forward in Latin America. I'm not going to talk too much more about the background. I think probably given the time, it's a good idea for me to jump into my discussion of Peru and Guatemala. So I'm going to talk for a brief moment about Peru, and then I'll jump into Guatemala. So both Peru and Guatemala, I should say, experienced quite difficult, long internal armed conflicts. The Peruvian armed conflict went from 1980 to 2000, 20 years in which around 70,000 people were killed. Countless more people were forcibly displaced. Victims of torture and sexual abuse, other kinds of human rights abuses. And in the Guatemalan case, the war is actually a little bit longer, between 1960, when the first insurgent movement arose challenging military rule in Guatemala, until 1996, when actual peace accords were signed between the guerrilla movement and the Guatemalan state. So 36 years in the case of Guatemala, and there something like 20,000 people were killed. 1 million people were forced to leave the country or were forcibly displaced inside Guatemala. So I have a little bit of a cold, and I think I'm going to need to pop a cough drop in my mouth. Excuse me 1 second. So I'm not going to talk too much about the actual violence. I'm happy to do so in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus really on the post-conflict period. And I'm going to talk about the truth commissions that were established in these countries, which was really a really crucial and important step to making the prosecutions that later happened even possible. So in the case of Peru, the transition happened in 2000. The authoritarian government of Alberto Fujimori collapsed in November of 2000. Fujimori fled the country, and he went to Japan, which was the home of his parents' birthplace. And he was given basically citizenship in Japan. There was an interim government put in place that established this Truth Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. to investigate the causes and consequences of the political violence, and to recommend measures to address the legacy of and the whole thing got cut off there, the legacy of the conflict. And to guarantee, to suggest measures to ensure that this kind of violence didn't happen again, right? So here you can see some of the key findings of the Truth Commission. As I said already, 69,000 people killed, 15,000 forcibly disappeared, although this number is actually higher now. This number is more like 22,000 now through new investigations. 600,000 displaced, and so on. Widespread torture, sexual violence, and so on. This is actually an interesting fact in both the Peruvian and the Guatemalan case. The primary victims of the violence were rural indigenous peasants. In the case of Peru, you can see that 79% of victims were rural dwellers, and 75% of the victims spoke Quechua or another native language as their mother tongue, which is sort of an indication of their indigeneity, when that represents only 16% of the total population in Peru. So you can see how disproportionately this falls on the indigenous population. This is all from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, by the way, these numbers. In the case of Guatemala, which I'll show in a minute, 83% of the victims were indigenous farmers or peasants, campesinos. So in both cases, you can see how heavily and disproportionately violence affected the most excluded and marginalized peoples of both of these countries. The perpetrators in Peru is a very unique case in a way. In most of the Latin American dictatorships, including the Guatemalan, the vast majority of human rights abuses were committed by state agents. Right? In the case of Guatemala, as we'll see, it's 93%. The Peruvian case is slightly different, in part because of the nature of the insurgency in Peru. The Shining Path Maoist insurgency deployed violence on a much grander scale than the typical guerrilla movement in Latin America. And as you can see, it's responsible, according to the Truth Commission, to over 50% of the human rights abuses that occurred in Peru. That doesn't mean that the state did not commit abuses. The state was responsible for around 37%. The state and its allied groups, including paramilitary organizations, right? And of course, the biggest group was the Shining Path. The MRTA, which is another group, was responsible for a very small percentage. But this is a very unique phenomenon for Latin America, the role of the Shining Path. So impunity, as I've already mentioned, was sort of the norm in Peru for these kinds of abuses. Especially for government officials, right? So there were efforts so members of Shining Path, they might have been killed in combat, they might have been forcibly disappeared, so some of them may no longer be around, but many of them were actually arrested and prosecuted. Now, the nature of the trials, especially under the Fujimori regime, were challenged. The Inter-American Court determined that those trials were not respectful of due process rights, which I talked about at the very beginning, and Peru had to completely redo them. But Abimael Guzman, the head of the Shining Path, the top leaders of the Shining Path, were all re-prosecuted, and they were all convicted for a second time and imprisoned. Guzman died recently in jail, about a year and a half ago. I already mentioned the amnesty law in Peru in '95 that protected military and police officials from being prosecuted for human rights abuses, and I already mentioned the Inter-American Court ruling that essentially revoked that amnesty law and allowed for human rights trials to move forward. But before we get to that, I just wanted to talk about the role of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Peru is really important. Because for the first time, there were truth commissions in Chile and El Salvador and Guatemala, and none of them really recommended prosecutions, in part because they recognized that prosecutions were going to be impossible. The justice systems were too weak, too compromised, too corrupt, and the military, frankly, was still too strong. And it's not that was not also the case in Peru, but the Inter-American Court had just overturned the amnesty laws, and all these changes have been happening both in Latin America and internationally in favor of individual criminal accountability. And so I think this is what convinces the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission to recommend not just reparations for victims or memorials for victims, but to also recommend criminal prosecutions. And what they end up doing is they investigate 100 cases in detail. And in the end, they take 47 of these cases, the entire archive, and they recommend these cases for prosecuting. They send the files over to the Peruvian legal system and said, your job is now to prosecute these. Now, ironically, the majority of these cases do have to do with the military and police, because as I already said, the majority of the Shining Path people had already been either arrested or were dead. And they've been arrested and prosecuted, or they were dead, right? But where the impunity was with the state officials. And that's why these cases focus primarily on state officials, or former state officials. And at the same time, in addition to these 47 cases, individuals also started bringing charges on their own to the judicial system. So you begin to start to see, you know, a ballooning of cases emerging in the Peruvian justice system. I'm not going to talk about all the many cases. I've been able to document over 70 sentences in Peru to date, involving over 250 military, police officials, and occasional civilians. I'm going to talk about the former head of state, Fujimori, who was finally put on trial in Peru. Not because it's more important than the other trials, but there is something quite stunning about a former head of state being put on trial for human rights. It's very unusual. And as I said before, it's very unusual for this to happen in a domestic court of law. So as I said, you know, Fujimori, after he fled the country, he was protected, essentially living in Japan. And honestly, I can tell you, no one really believed he would ever be held accountable for his crimes, right? Because the Japanese government was protecting him, the Peruvian government was trying to get him extradited, and Japan was essentially ignoring this request. And then surprisingly, in 2005, Fujimori flies from Japan and he lands, you can see him here, getting off the plane, he lands in Chile. And his plan is from Chile to launch his return to politics in Peru. There are elections coming up in 2006. And Fujimori was still pretty popular, even though he was a dictator, even though he fled the country because there were a series of corruption scandals that had emerged. And his advisors apparently convinced him that he would have a good go of it if he ran for president again. Only all the things that I've been just talking about, the advances in international human rights law and in Latin American human rights law, they didn't have that registered apparently. So Fujimori was literally within hours arrested by Chilean authorities, and then the Peruvian state quickly, the extradition case that it had built for Japan, it now sent on to Chile. And in 2 years later, in 2007, the Chilean Supreme Court approved Fujimori's extradition, and the trial against him started. It was supposed to start in November 2007. I think it actually started in December 2007. And so here, this is a picture of the inside of the courtroom. Here you see Fujimori. Here you see the panel of judges. These are the human rights lawyers representing the victims. Here are the prosecutors. What you don't see is over here. Oops, sorry. There's a panel of lawyers. There are like 8 Fujimori lawyers over on this side. And here you see Fujimori's followers, and here are some of the families of the victims and survivors. And then there's a little box for the press. This was the first time, of course, a president was ever extradited in the world, that a president was extradited from one country to his home country to stand trial for human rights abuses. I'm not sure if any of you have heard about Pinochet's visit to London, where Spain tried to have him extradited from the UK to stand trial in Spain on charges of torture. And in principle, the UK law lords agreed that on the principle of universal jurisdiction, he could be extradited. But then they, in a very political decision, a very controversial decision, decided that, oh, he has dementia, so for humanitarian reasons, we're going to let him go home, and we're not actually going to send him on to Spain. So that would have been the first case, even though it would not have been his home country, it would have been the first time an extradition of that kind would have worked. Instead, Pinochet went back to Chile. He was accused and prosecuted and processed for abuses of human rights, but he was never put on trial. He died before the case could come to trial. So it's a really unprecedented case. And it was unprecedented in a sort of a newly consolidating democracy to put someone so powerful on trial based on this essential democratic principle that no one is above the law, equality before the law, right? We talked about this a little bit in class this morning about how that doesn't always seem to be the case, but we can talk about that more later. So Fujimori was charged in 4 human rights cases. That's not because there are only 4 human rights accusations against him. The nature of the treaty between Peru and Chile means that he can only be prosecuted for cases for which the Chilean Supreme Court approves his extradition. So that's why it's such a narrow number of both corruption and human rights cases. But they were big cases. It was the Barrios Santos case, the case that had already had a verdict from the Inter-American Court finding the Peruvian state responsible. The Cantuta case, which was a case of the forced disappearance of 9 students and a university professor. Both of these were committed by the Grupo Colina, a paramilitary. It was really a military, a bunch of military officials. So to call it paramilitary is not exactly correct, but they operated clandestinely, right? And they were operated during the Fujimori government. And for 2 kidnappings of a journalist, Gustavo Gorriti, who still is probably the most important journalist, I think, in Peru today, and a businessman, Samuel Dyer. He was later prosecuted for corruption and abuse of authority in other trials by the same tribunal. And he's actually facing new trials because the Peruvian state, under a different government, not the current one, requested that new trials be opened against him on a series of cases, the Pativilca massacre, the Castro massacre, and they're trying to get him prosecuted for the case of forced sterilizations. Under his government, a reported 300,000 men and women, mostly women, were forcibly sterilized as part of a family control plan, which I'd be happy to talk about later. Of course, Fujimori claimed his innocence. He said that these were excesses. He had no responsibility. He didn't give the orders. It was necessary to combat terrorism. And remember, Peru was facing a very vicious and brutal insurgent movement. So many people do buy into this argument. I think it's important to say that. His supporters claimed the trial was the work of Fujimori's enemies, that it was meant to prevent him from returning to politics because they were all afraid of him because he's so popular, so on and so forth. But the fact is, this was an exemplary trial. It respected his due process rights like to a T, like almost in excess. I made a joke this morning that if he had a hangnail, the court would suspend the session and allow him time to get better and then would resume the hearings. So this was one of the reasons it took a year and almost a year and a half for the case to culminate, right? He was allowed to bring as many witnesses in his favor as he wanted. He was allowed to cross-examine the witnesses. He was allowed to cross-examine the witnesses by both sides, on the other side, and so forth. Here you can see, okay, this was the head of the Colina Group Death Squad. Fujimori actually called on him in his defense, which is probably was not the smartest thing for him to do, because there was a video which they showed in court of him admitting to carrying out these massacres. That did not really help Fujimori. Okay, this was Montesinos, Fujimori's #1 security advisor. Both of these men are also now in jail, prosecuted for a series of human rights abuses. Montesinos also for arms trafficking, for corruption, and a series of other things. This was a fully transparent process. The media were given full access to the trial. The trial was broadcast, so at the times I couldn't be in the courtroom, although I am in there. I am in the courtroom right there. Much younger. I could watch it from my home on the internet. The press was allowed in. It was broadcast on television. reporters could report on it. It helped ensure that it was a free and fair process. And it also helped, and this was important, it also helped prevent political interference, right? The president at the time that Fujimori was extradited was Alan Garcia, who was the president right before Fujimori, under whom there were also massive human rights violations, and human rights groups were also trying to pursue criminal prosecutions against him. So he didn't really necessarily want this precedent to move forward. But I've interviewed the judges, and I've been told that there was no effort by Garcia to pressure the judges to impede or otherwise interfere in the trial. Fujimori was found guilty on April 7th. We're almost coming up to the anniversary. He was found guilty not using international law, using Peruvian law, right? To avoid, I think the court wanted to avoid any suspicion, any concern that this was not a Peruvian trial, right? They found him guilty of aggravated homicide, 25 counts of aggravated homicide, aggravated harm and lesions, and aggravated kidnapping. He was sentenced to 25 years of prison, which doesn't seem like a lot. But in Peru, they don't allow sentences to accumulate. So the maximum conviction for aggravated homicide is 25 years. And even though it was 25 people times 25, so you do the math, it doesn't work that way in the Peruvian case. It does in Guatemala. It's interesting. In Guatemala, they hand out sentences of like 2,000 years, 6,000 years. That's kind of insane. The court, interestingly, the court also established that the members who were killed, the people who were killed by the Colina group in both cases were not members of the Shining Path, which the victims reported to be a very important step toward dignifying the memory of their loved ones, because they've been and of themselves, because they've been constantly stigmatized as being members of Shining Path and somehow deserving their fate, right? So that was seen as very important. And I love this quote by Reda Condor, whose son was one of the disappeared from Cantuta. She said, "The conviction of Fujimori is proof that even for the poor, there can be justice." And I don't have time to talk about the pardon. Fujimori was pardoned in 2017 on Christmas Eve. It was a very cruel thing to do. People massively protested, as you can see in this Twitter image. The victims went to the Inter-American Court for Human Rights and said, this violates our rights, it violates the American Convention. The court agreed, and they ordered Peru to send him back to jail, and that is what they did. He is now still in prison. So that's an extraordinary example of how there's a synergy or complementarity between domestic courts and international courts, regional or international courts in the case of Peru. I'm kind of out of time because I wanted to leave time for Q&A, but I don't want to give Guatemala short shrift. So I'm going to spend maybe 5 minutes on Guatemala and then try to open it up for discussion. So Guatemala is an example of a country, just, not that different from Peru, where after the end of the war, the justice system was sort of in tatters. There really hadn't even been a functioning justice system in Guatemala. Guatemala was a country that, for most of its Republican history, was governed by the military, right? So in the aftermath of the peace accords, there was really not a lot of hope that there would be successful prosecutions of war crimes. There were efforts, and most of them failed, right? But things did begin to change in Guatemala, and I'm going to skip through like 10 years of history in just a second. Around 2007, so the UN, this is important, I think, to note, the UN did help Guatemala end the conflict and brokered the peace accords between the government and the URNG guerrilla movement. And they stayed in Guatemala after the peace accords were signed, and they were there to kind of oversee the implementation. But things were not going so great. The justice system was not consolidating into rule of law. Organized crime networks, many of them connected to the very military officials who had committed human rights abuses during the war, were running rampant. Violence was out of control. Organized crime, drug trafficking was out of control. So the international community decides to adopt this very unique model. They created this organization called the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, the UN body that was sent to Guatemala to help develop Guatemala's justice system, help strengthen the capacity, the autonomy, and the independence of the Attorney General's office, the public ministry, and of the judicial system. One of the most important things they did was create this thing called the high-risk courts, where, certainly they saw cases like the gangs or drug trafficking or organized crime, but human rights cases also started to be seen in these high-risk court system. But as important as the international community's intervention was the fact that a new generation of judges and prosecutors start coming into office in Guatemala. And there's no better example of this than Claudia Paz y Paz. And I think I have a nice picture of her somewhere. There she is, Claudia Paz y Paz, who was appointed Attorney General in 2010 after a very complex process that I won't get into. She was a pioneering human rights lawyer who had worked with the Guatemalan Bishop's office and another human rights group in Guatemala. And she really made fighting impunity for past and present crimes her mission. And it's under her leadership that Guatemala really starts trying to, despite all the odds, despite the continued power of the military, despite challenges in the justice system, Guatemala really does try to pursue cases against human rights abusers. And to everyone's surprise, in 2000, so let me just say, Rios Montt, Efraín Rios Montt had been a general during the internal armed conflict, and between 82 and 83, he was the de facto president. He carried out a coup against Lucas Garcia in 82, and then he was ousted in a coup by his Minister of Defense in 83. He was in power for something like 17 months. But those 17 months were the most intense months of state-sponsored violence in the Guatemalan civil conflict, according to the Guatemalan Truth Commission, the Commission for Historical Clarification. So after the peace accord were signed, Rios Montt was surprisingly popular man, and he was elected to Congress. He would have become president had it not been for the fact that there was a constitutional ban on people who carried out coups running for president, right? And because I know it sounds bizarre, but it's true. In 2011, he is no longer a congressman. So all those years he had immunity because he was a congressman. He steps down as a congressman, and Claudia Paz y Paz sees an opportunity, and she files charges against him. I mean, they've been obviously working on the case. She files charges against him. He comes in, he declares to the judge who's investigating the case, and he's put under house arrest. No one imagined this would happen, and certainly no one imagined that he would ever be put on trial and that he would ever be prosecuted. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Here you have, this is a picture of Rios Montt the day that he asked to speak to the court, defending, just like Fujimori did, defending his rule as, I was saving Guatemala from those communists and so on and so forth, and failing to acknowledge, any harm in the process. This is the day of the final verdict, when he was found guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity against the Maya Ixil population. Here you can see him, he's getting a little nervous because he's realizing that as the judge is reading the verdict, he's realizing that he is being convicted. And he actually starts, I don't remember the words, but he actually starts threatening the judge in the middle of having just been convicted. And he actually tried to escape through this little door. I was in the courtroom, and I saw all of this. I'm not telling you this secondhand. I saw all of this. He tried to escape through this little door, and she called on the judicial guards to come and stop him and remand him to the military prison. And it was amazing. She said at one point, she said, I have to stay here. She's directing herself to the people who were in the gallery. She said, we the tribunal has to stay here until the judicial authorities come and bring him, but you all can leave. And everyone was like, we're not leaving, we're staying. And that was sort of this moment where everyone was sort of watching, anticipating what was happening. And here you see the members of the Achille community celebrating outside the courtroom after the afternoon after the verdict was handed down. There you go. Efraín Rios-Montt culpable, or guilty. However, and this is what marks a very significant difference from the Peru case. And with that, I'll wrap up. The day after the verdict was handed down on May 10th, 2013, CACIF, which is the very powerful association of Guatemalan business leaders, they held a press conference and they called on the Constitutional Court to overturn the verdict. They said there was no genocide in Guatemala. They said that his due process rights had been violated and that he should be allowed to go free. And 9 days later, the Constitutional Court obliged, showing that in fact, the efforts to establish judicial autonomy and independence in Guatemala hadn't gone far enough, right? And that's the sad part of the story in Guatemala. All of that said, it is important to note that other cases have moved forward in the Guatemalan court system. And I've been in the courtroom documenting many of them, and I'm just gonna, the Seposarco trial, 2 military officials were convicted for sexual violence, sexual slavery, and domestic slavery against 15 Kekchi women. Here you see the women in the courtroom during the trial. 4 senior officials were convicted in the Molina Tyson case of sexual violence against Emma, the forced disappearance and crimes against humanity against Emma, and for the forced disappearance of her 14-year-old brother, Marco Antonio, who you see here in 1981. And most recently in January of last year, 5 former paramilitary officials were convicted of sexual violence against the Maya Achi women. There are still a few others awaiting trial, if that ever happens, because there's this dramatic backtracking going on in Guatemala today. Many judges and prosecutors have been forced into exile. Things are taking a downturn in Guatemala, not only in response to efforts to prosecute war crimes, but there's also very huge efforts in Guatemala to prosecute corruption, government corruption, the corruption of economic elites who were engaged in illegal or illicit campaign contributions to different political parties during the last few presidential campaigns and so forth. And so that sort of galvanized military and economic elites to come together and try to roll all this back. And so now in Guatemala, we're seeing a very dramatic moment of, it's unclear, it's unlikely, I should say, that these kinds of cases are going to move forward, at least in the present moment. I think I'll wrap up because I've tried your patience, I think. I'll invite comments or questions from the audience.
Quickly want to remind our Zoom participants that you could also use the Zoom button for questions and answers, and we will be fielding both, hopefully with the help of David Aviles, our CLAPS GA, and David here on IT technology to help us do that. So please, both here and online, feel free to ask questions. So I have a question, if no one else wants to start. So you mentioned that you think things are taking a turn in Guatemala, and with the reversal of the trial for Rios-Montt, do you see absolutely no way that this will happen in the near future anymore?
Well, remember that the reversal in the Rios-Montt case took place in 2013. And between 2013 and today, we've seen a number of prosecutions move forward. There was a period between when the Rios-Montt thing happened and 2015 that things were looking very serious. There's a few cases that were already in the courts moved forward, like the the massacre in the Spanish embassy, which is where the father of Rigoberta Menchú, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, was killed. That took place in 2015. But in 2015, if you'll recall, for several months in Guatemala, there were mass protests over corruption that involved the sitting president, Otto Perez Molina, also a former general, and his vice president, Roxana Valdetti, and a number of other government officials that eventually led to them stepping down and being put on trial and convicted for corruption. And that kind of opened up a new opportunity for prosecutions and for human rights prosecutors, as well as anti-corruption prosecutions to move forward. In the case of the corruption process, very much in connection with the work of the CC, that UN body that I mentioned earlier. But these cases, the CC was not actually allowed to work on these cases. Their mandate only involved present day corruption and organized crime cases. So there was, in fact, and have been, a number of really important cases that have moved through the justice system. Today, there are still cases that we're tracking, we're monitoring. You can go to our Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Verdad y Justicia in Guatemala, and you can read about all the trials that are still going on in Guatemala. In May of 2021, a huge case broke. The government arrested 11 and then eventually 15 in total military and police officials and one civilian who were accused in the military diary case, which is a case of a document, military intelligence document that was leaked to an American investigator, Kate Doyle, and documents the forced disappearance, the extrajudicial execution, and other crimes against about around 195 Guatemalans. That case also has an inter-American court sentence, which has been a very helpful factor in moving it forward in the judicial system in Guatemala. Intermediate phase, and in this case is a really good example of the hopes and problems in Guatemala on these cases, right? So in May of last year, the intermediate phase hearings were held, and the judge in charge of the case, Miguel Ángel Galvez, ruled that the case was divided into different pieces. So he was ruling on 9 of the 15 in total, and he ruled to send those 9 to trial, and then he was going to rule on the other ones in subsequent hearings. And then he started getting death threats. Spurious legal cases began to be filed against him. Strange men with weapons began appearing in his condominium complex where no arms were allowed, and so on and so forth. And he, about 5 or 6 months later, he left the country and resigned as judge after 23 years of an incredibly illustrious career. He's the guy who sent Rios Montt to trial. He's the guy who sent Otto Perez Molina and Roxana Valdetti to trial. And now he's living in exile. So he tried in a context that was extremely hostile and difficult to move the case forward. And for that, he basically lost his career. He lost his livelihood. And now he's one of 30 plus judges and prosecutors from Guatemala living in exile. Most who were involved in anti-corruption cases, to be fair, and Judge Galvez was involved in both. And this case in particular touched networks of military officials who committed grave atrocities in the past, but were also deeply involved in corruption and violence in the present. And I believe it's that connection between the past and present that made this case the one that broke the camel's back in terms of at least the permanence of Judge Galvez in Guatemala. Yeah. So with his departure, it looks pretty bleak. There are still a handful of, there's still independent prosecutors in the Human Rights Office. There's still a few independent judges, but they're fewer and farther between. That there's been sort of what Guatemalans call a co-optation of the justice system by judges who have either been bought off or intimidated or were even placed directly by these powerful sectors.
It's sad.
It is sad. It is sad because Guatemala for a while showed how much could be achieved if a little bit of technical support, a little bit of political support, some good, well-trained prosecutors and judges in your country, and you can do miracles. You can really attack, structures of corruption. You can really attack structures of organized crime. You can really try to address some of the legacies of the most violent period in Guatemalan history, perhaps except for the conquest itself. And it's I
guess jumping off of that then, in your experience, how much support are these justice departments really getting from their political administrations? Meaning, how much of it is a new administration saying, yeah, sure, we're going to make a commission, and they just put one down on paper essentially, and then how often are they actually devoting serious resources?
That's a good question. So I'll talk about Peru to give an answer to that. So after the Truth Commission put out its report, one of its recommendations was to the justice system to strengthen the capacity of the public ministry and of the court system so that they could investigate and prosecute these kinds of cases. And resources were actually given. So, reformist, new democratic government gave resources to do just that. The public ministry created a special human rights system that was devoted exclusively to investigating human rights crimes, which is really fantastic because the prosecutors acquire a level of expertise in investigating human rights crime. They develop a series of protocols that facilitate investigations into what are really very complex crimes to investigate. Not only because they took place so many years ago, and oftentimes it's very hard to come by evidence, or also because you don't have access to military documents because the military continues to refuse to open its archives and so on. The same thing with the justice system in Peru also created it's called the Sala Penal Nacional, the National Criminal Court, and it was charged primarily with dealing with human rights crimes. Its mandate then expanded, and there's a lot of interference going on at some point to kind of diminish the focus on human rights because it was making some people very unhappy. And today, what's happened in the context of this new change in government, you now have a very conservative government that's taken power in the last couple of months. The Attorney General has actually shut down the special human rights system altogether and changed it to a special system for terrorism. Because the current government is arguing people out protesting in Peru against the government are all terrorists. And so they want to free up space in the criminal justice system to persecute, they would say prosecute, I'm going to say persecute, stick with what I said, the people who are protesting. So the question that you're asking is really important. Like, do governments provide the resources to make these trials happen, to give the judges and prosecutors what they need to investigate and then adjudicate these cases? One of the things, after I did the Fujimori trial, I started tracking other human rights prosecutions, and one of my most constant complaints was that precisely the budget for the prosecutors and the judges was being reduced, so that it was resulting in this really drawn out investigations and really drawn out court cases. And I'll just give you one quick example: the Ajomarca massacre, which took place in 1985, during the Alan Garcia government. The investigation took forever. Once it finally came to trial in November of 2010, it took 6 years for the case to culminate. It finalized in 2016, September 2000. That's insane. That's not justice. And that's really deeply victimizing to the people who are already victims, right? So that question of resource and capacity is very important. So you can kill a really good project by just starving it of resources. And that's probably true in any reform process. That's a really good question. Thanks. Yes.
I just wanted to expand on something that came up a little bit in class today as to the jurisdiction of the Inter-American System for Human Rights here in the United States. And you had mentioned that they had tried to get Kissinger under.
Well, Chile actually tried to have Henry Kissinger, the head of state under the Nixon administration, when the US was participating actively in the overthrow of the Allende government and the coup that brought Pinochet to power. They tried to extradite Kissinger to answer for certain crimes during the Pinochet government. And of course, the US is like, no, we're not gonna. That did not involve the Inter-American system.
Oh, it did.
That was the Chilean
I see.
court system.
Because I was gonna ask whether there had been any attempts through because the US recognizes the Inter-American system, right, as part of the OAS.
Yes
I mean, at
and
least in
no.
theory, right?
Yes and no, and there are increasingly more cases. A colleague of mine just brought a case about a Mexican national who was killed by Border Patrol officials, US Border Patrol officials. I think it was on Mexican territory. There's all kinds of laws about you can't do that. And they brought that case to the Inter-American system because it's not been moving forward in the US. That's a really important thing for a case to go to the Inter-American system. You have to demonstrate to the commission that your court system is not capable of providing you with justice. So when you have these amnesty laws and this institutionalized impunity, it's not that difficult. And so the commission and the court will accept these cases, right? The US is a little more difficult because in principle, we have a pretty good functioning criminal justice system, but we don't always, do we? So I think that these kinds of cases are going to start coming up more and more. The US, I think that they don't recognize the contentious jurisdiction of the Inter-American Court, just like we don't recognize the ICC, even though we want them to prosecute Putin, and it doesn't make any sense.
But from another angle, as a question of evidence, I mean, given the US involvement in the dirty wars throughout Latin America, would that be, I'm just wondering whether that could work as evidence, because in terms of bringing anybody to trial.
From the US?
Yeah.
So there's that problem of power that we talked about earlier today, right? Who's gonna bring the superpower to trial? Whether it's, from acts committed 30 years ago, or acts committed today. Which is one of the reasons that the ICC indictment of Putin is so, it's powerful, but it's also, is it actually gonna work? Right? He may not be able to go to Brussels, but then again, George Bush doesn't go to Brussels either. That's the power of international law. At this point, it's just limiting people like them who could potentially be prosecuted internationally from going to certain places where there's universal jurisdiction or where there may be other kinds of charges against them. Yes.
So following up on that last question, we're talking a lot about how the US played a role in many of the things that have happened. And much of your presentation has taken place with military dictatorships that existed in the mid to late 20th century. And I was just wondering, what role does the Cold War play in many of these human rights violations?
The Cold War is front and center, right? All these regimes were regimes that emerged in the context of the Cold War and the rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. The national security doctrine that I mentioned briefly in the presentation was a kind of artifact of the Cold War, and the military regimes adopted that doctrine as part of this Cold War, division of power. And they use that doctrine to essentially justify military involvement in politics, the military takeover of the political system, the elimination of any dissent, and so forth. So the Cold War is really front and center. And that's one of the reasons you see, once the Berlin Wall falls and the Soviet Union dissolves itself, the US says, okay, we're done with Central America, let's wrap all this up, let's have peace accords. And the US was very active in supporting peace accords when, for all those years, the US had been very actively backing, military governments in Central America, or in the case of Nicaragua, the Contras trying to overthrow the Sandinista regime. So yeah, the Cold War is front and center. Yeah. There's one thing that's interesting. So the International Criminal Court hasn't played a huge role in these kinds of human rights abuses because the court was only created in 2002, and it can only hear cases from 2002 forward. So none of the cases that I'm talking about can fall under the purview of the ICC. However, cases now can. So the ICC has an office in Caracas, and they're investigating human rights abuses in Venezuela. They were investigating cases in Colombia, and I think that pressure led Colombia to adopt a very robust transitional justice process to try to deal with some of the legacies of the war in Colombia. I think there is talk of, I'm not sure it's actually culminated, of an investigation to Mexico, where, as you know, over 100,000 people have been disappeared in the last, since 2006, basically. So the ICC could potentially, play a much bigger role for Latin America than it has for these kinds of cases connected to the Cold War, because it's a different period of time. And that's really important and interesting to think about. It's not something that I've worked on closely because all my cases are connected to this earlier period. But it is something that's going to change the landscape for human rights in Latin America, I think. Right.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Burt, for your presentation. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you everyone online for being here. We hope we can next semester bring you another speaker at least here to campus. And it was our pleasure. Thank you very much. Please give her a round of applause.